Daniel Hayes wasn't a man of words. He let his hands speak for him. Calloused, grease-stained fingers marked by tiny scars from slipped screwdrivers. At 38, he'd grown used to living without much explanation. His life was a cycle of sameness, waking at 5 a.m., brewing coffee in the dusty kitchen of his small home on the outskirts of Clarksville, Tennessee, then driving his aging 1998 Ford F-150 to the family garage, where he and his younger brother Tommy earned a living fixing old trucks and broken-down cars. October 22, 2015 was nothing special. The sky outside carried the pale gray of fall, the first cold wind sweeping golden leaves across the dirt road leading to Hayes Brothers' garage. The radio in the corner blared Sweet Home Alabama for the third time that day, drowning out Tommy's grumbling about a client who wouldn't pay on time. Daniel crouched beside a Chevy Impala with faulty brakes, sweat beading on his forehead despite the 60-degree chill. He didn't much like fall. It reminded him of things fading, much like his marriage to Sarah, which was growing distant in ways he couldn't fix. Sarah. Her name alone tightened his chest. Married for 11 years with 2 kids, Emma, 8 and Noah, 5. Their evenings in the little wooden house were now filled with heavy silence. Sarah worked part-time at a grocery store in downtown Clarksville, and when she came home, her eyes lacked the spark Daniel had once fallen for. They didn't fight much, but the distance hurt more than any argument. He knew he was partly to blame. His temper, his late nights with beer to escape the mounting bills and the garage's dwindling business. "Dan, you done with those brakes? Peterson wants his car by 5. Tommy called from across the garage, holding a greasy wrench. 6 years younger, with blonde hair and their mother's blue eyes, Tommy was the optimist to Daniel's brooding. Sometimes Daniel envied him, though he'd never admit it. "Done," Daniel replied, standing and wiping his hands on an old rag hanging on the wall. He glanced at the clock, 4:45 p.m. "You handle it. I'm heading home. Sarah's staying late at the store, so I need to pick up the kids from Grandma's." Tommy nodded, tossing him a lopsided grin. "Don't forget milk. Em'll scream if there's none for her cereal tomorrow." Daniel grunted, stepping outside to his truck. The Ford sputtered to life, its engine as worn as he felt. The 20-minute drive home wound through harvested cornfields and scattered wooden houses. The local radio buzzed about a presidential debate. Donald Trump had said something controversial as usual, but Daniel switched it off. Politics didn't matter to him. All he cared about was paying the electric bill and keeping the kids warm when winter hit. At the intersection near home, the sun was nearly set, painting the sky a brilliant orange streaked with purple. The traffic light blinked green and Daniel eased on the gas. He didn't see the logging truck barreling through the red light from his right. A horn blared, headlights blinded him, and then a deafening crash as the world shattered around him. When Daniel came to, or rather when awareness returned, he wasn't in the wreckage of his truck. He stood in a vast field, endless green grass stretching beneath a gentle light, softer than the sun he knew yet brighter than moonlight. The air was pure, filling his lungs with a vitality he'd never felt. He looked at his hands, no grease, no scars. He felt light, as if every burden had melted away. "Where am I?" he wondered, the question echoing in his mind but not escaping his lips. He scanned the horizon for something familiar. The road home, the garage, the twisted metal of his truck. But there was only the field and an infinite sky. Then he saw him. A man stood a few steps away, simple yet radiating an indescribable majesty. Dressed in a plain white robe, his deep brown eyes met Daniel's, piercing through every thought, every hidden pain. No introduction was needed. A certainty swelled in Daniel's chest. This was Jesus. "Daniel," he said, his voice warm like a spring breeze yet powerful enough to stir Daniel's soul. Daniel wanted to kneel to speak, but his legs froze, his throat dry. Jesus stepped closer, placing a hand on his shoulder. The sensation was unlike anything earthly. Like all his fears, sins, and failures were washed away in a cool stream. "You've come a long way," he said, and Daniel knew he wasn't just talking about the accident. He meant Daniel's life, the sleepless nights worrying about his kids, the times he'd yelled at Sarah in anger, the moments he'd questioned if he was living right. Tears spilled down Daniel's face, not from pain, but from feeling wholly loved for the first time without condition. Jesus led him through the field, and images unfolded before Daniel like a living film. He saw himself at 5, playing in his grandmother's yard in Memphis, laughing as she chased him with a broom for breaking her favorite vase. He saw his wedding day with Sarah, her eyes sparkling as she said, "I do," in a small Clarksville church. He saw darker moments, nights alone with cheap beer, harsh words thrown at loved ones. Yet beside Jesus he felt no shame. Everything seemed to fall into place, part of a larger picture he hadn't understood. "You still have time," Jesus said, his voice resonating in Daniel's heart. "Live with love, Daniel. That's all that remains when everything else fades." The light grew blinding, forcing Daniel to shut his eyes. He heard beeping, panic shouts. When he opened them, he was on a hospital bed in Nashville, the crash a fading echo. The steady beeping pulled Daniel from the light. He awoke to a white hospital ceiling, the sharp smell of antiseptic stinging his nose. His head throbbed, his chest felt crushed, and he couldn't move his limbs. A breathing tube silenced him and machines hummed beside him. "Daniel? Daniel, you're awake." Sarah's trembling voice broke through. He tried to turn his head, but pain stopped him. He could only glance. She stood there, eyes red, hair disheveled, clutching his hand. Tommy was beside her, pale but relieved. "He's awake. Get the doctor," Tommy shouted, rushing out. Sarah leaned closer, tears falling onto Daniel's hand. "You scared me to death, you idiot," she whispered, choking up. "Don't ever do that again, okay?" Daniel wanted to tell her about the field, about him, but the tube stopped him. He blinked, the only response he could give. A doctor entered, checked the monitors, and turned to Sarah. "He's past the worst, but recovery will take time. Multiple broken ribs, internal injuries. It's a miracle he's alive." Sarah nodded, her eyes fixed on Daniel. When the doctor and Tommy left, she sat beside him, still holding his hand. "The kids are with Grandma," she said softly. "Emma cried all night missing you. Noah keeps asking where you are." I didn't know how to explain. Daniel looked at her, and for the first time in years, he truly saw her. Not through the lens of their struggles, but with gratitude. He thought of Jesus' words. Live with love. He didn't know if he could fix everything with Sarah, but he wanted to try. He had to. Daniel left the hospital in early November, when Tennessee's winds turned biting. He rolled out in a wheelchair, chest still bandaged, legs weak from weeks of immobility. Tommy picked him up in the garage's truck, the Ford now a mangled memory. "You need a new ride, bro," Tommy joked, lightening the mood. "Something tougher this time." Daniel nodded, staring out the window. Bare cornfields passed by, and for a moment, he thought he glimpsed the green field again. But reality snapped him back. He was going home, broken but alive. Home wasn't easy. Sarah quit her grocery job to care for him, straining their finances further. Emma and Noah were thrilled to have him back, but his constant presence disrupted their routine. Some nights their laughter filled the house. Others, Sarah and he sat in silence, unsure what to say. One day, as he practiced walking with a wooden crutch Tommy made, Sarah entered with a stack of bills. "We can't pay the electric this month, Daniel," she said, exhausted. "Insurance only covered part of your hospital stay, and the garage has barely had customers." Guilt hit him like a wave. "I'll go back to work soon," he said, though his body wasn't ready. "Tommy can handle most of it. I'll just supervise." "No," Sarah snapped. "You need to rest. You almost died, Daniel. I don't want to lose you again." Her words stunned him. It was the first time in years she'd shown she still cared. He took her hand, ignoring the pain in his shoulder. "We'll get through this, Sarah. I promise." She didn't pull away, but she didn't speak either. They sat in the dim room, lit only by an old lamp, and Daniel felt their home still held a family. One frigid Sunday morning, Daniel did something he hadn't in years. He went to church. He didn't tell Sarah or the kids, just slipped on an old coat and hobbled out with his crutch. The small church down the road, where his mother once took him weekly, stood unchanged, white steeple weathered, pews scratched. Pastor James, an elderly man with a warm voice, preached about forgiveness. Daniel sat in the back, listening, feeling the words pierce him. After the service, James approached. "Haven't seen you in a while, Daniel. Heard about your accident." "Yeah," Daniel nodded. "I think it's time I find some things again." James smiled, not pressing further. God has a way of calling us back, whatever the path. From then on, Daniel read his mother's old Bible, its margins filled with her scribbled notes. He didn't grasp everything, but it brought him comfort. He began praying, not eloquent pleas but clumsy words from his heart. Thank you for letting me live. Help me do right. Christmas 2016 was the first in years that the Hayes family truly came together. Sarah set up a small tree in the living room, adorned with old string lights and crafts Emma made at school. Noah ran circles around it, singing Jingle Bells off-key, while Daniel watched from his chair, a warmth spreading in his chest he couldn't name. He couldn't afford fancy gifts, but he and Tommy spent an afternoon crafting a wooden sled for Noah and a carved pencil box for Emma. That Christmas Eve, after the kids were asleep, Sarah sat beside Daniel with 2 mugs of hot cocoa. Snow fell lightly outside, blanketing the fields around their wooden house. Do you remember our first Christmas together? She asked, her voice soft. You dropped the turkey on the floor and blamed the neighbor's cat. Daniel laughed, then coughed from the lingering chest pain. Yeah, and that cat didn't even exist. I just didn't want you mad. She laughed too, a rare sound he hadn't heard in ages. Then she grew quiet, staring into her cooling cocoa. Daniel, she said finally, I don't know what happened to you in that accident, but you're different. I'm not sure I can get used to this new you. He felt a pang of worry. What do you mean? I mean, she hesitated. You used to be cold, distant. Now you care, you say things I never thought you would. I'm glad, but I'm scared. Scared you'll go back to how you were. He took her hand, wincing at the strain. I won't promise I'll be perfect, Sarah, but I'll try. I've seen what I almost lost, and I don't want to lose you or the kids again. She didn't reply, just nodded and rested her head on his shoulder. They sat there, bathed in the dim glow of the Christmas lights, and Daniel felt a crack in his heart begin to mend, if only slightly. Spring 2016 arrived with gentle rains and green returning to Tennessee's fields. Daniel ditched the crutch, though he walked slowly and rested often. Doctors said he might never fully recover. His lungs were permanently scarred, and long days in the garage were over. But he wasn't sad. He'd found a new purpose, not in cars or bills, but in family and the growing faith within him. One day, as he sat on the porch watching Emma and Noah play in the yard, Pastor James stopped by. He brought a cornbread loaf his wife made and sat beside Daniel. How you holding up? He asked, his voice kind. Better than before, Daniel replied. I'm learning to take it slow. James nodded, gazing at the kids. God often uses storms to teach us something. Don't you think? Daniel paused. He hadn't told anyone about his near-death experience, not even Sarah. But that spring day, under the soft sunlight, he opened up. He told James about the field, about Jesus, about the words that changed him. When he finished, James didn't react with surprise or doubt. He just smiled. God works in wondrous ways, Daniel. Maybe he chose you to remind others that love and faith are never too late. Those words lingered with Daniel. He started helping at church, not to stand out, but in his own quiet way. He fixed broken pews, though slowly, and sometimes told stories to the Sunday school kids. He wasn't great with words, but they loved his tales of old cars and battling engines in the garage. Sarah began joining him at church, not regularly, but enough to show she was trying to understand. One day, she held his hand during the sermon, and Daniel felt they were walking together again after so long. Just as things settled, a figure from Daniel's past disrupted their fragile peace. It was a May afternoon when Daniel sat in the garage with Tommy, guiding him on a Dodge Ram's cooling system. A battered car pulled up, paint peeling, and a man stepped out. Tall, dark hair half covering his face, cold blue eyes Daniel couldn't forget. Jake Miller, his high school best friend, unseen for 20 years. Daniel Hayes, Jake rasped, cigarette smoke curling from his lips, a smirk twisting his face. Heard you nearly bought it. Had to see if you were still kicking. Daniel stood, leaning on his chair for balance. Jake had been his shadow in youth, nights of stolen booze in abandoned barns, reckless races on back roads. But Jake had also dragged him into trouble. Shoplifting, brawls, nearly jail for vandalism. Daniel cut ties after meeting Sarah, determined to start over. Now Jake stood there, a chill from the past. What do you want, Jake? Daniel asked warily. Jake shrugged, exhaling smoke. Got out of prison. Need a place to crash. Heard you've got this garage, thought I'd lend a hand. For old time's sake, right? Tommy shot Daniel a guarded look. We're good, man, he said, stepping forward. Don't need help. Jake sneered, eyes locked on Daniel. You've changed, Dan. You wouldn't turn me down so quick back in the day. Anger flared in Daniel, but he held it back. He remembered Jesus' words, the field, and took a deep breath. I'm not that guy anymore, Jake. You should go. Jake smirked, stomped out his cigarette. Fine, but I'll be around. Call if you change your mind. He drove off, leaving dust in his wake. Tommy frowned. Who was that? An old mistake, Daniel muttered. But he knew Jake wasn't just the past, he was a test. A reminder that his new path wouldn't be easy. Jake didn't vanish as Daniel hoped. He lingered, showing up at the diner where Sarah bought breakfast, the basketball court where Noah played, even the church one Sunday. He didn't act, just watched, but his presence gnawed at Daniel. Sleep eluded him, nightmares of the past mixing with fading glimpses of the field. Sarah noticed. One night as they washed dishes together. A new routine, she asked. Who's the guy hanging around? You know him, don't you? Daniel stopped, holding a wet plate. He didn't want to hide anymore, not after all they'd rebuilt. His name's Jake, he said heavily. We were close as kids. He's trouble, Sarah. I cut him off years ago, but he's back and I don't know why. Her eyes widened with worry. Is he dangerous? I don't know, Daniel admitted. But I won't let him hurt you or the kids. She nodded, her hands clenching. Jake's shadow widened, old cracks between them. Sarah grew quieter, checked windows before bed, and sometimes Daniel heard her crying in the bathroom. He wanted to protect her, but his frail body and torn mind left him unsure how. One night, as Jake stood under an oak near the house, smoking and staring, Daniel confronted him. He hobbled out with his crutch despite Sarah's pleas. What do you want, Jake? He shouted, voice shaking with anger and cold. Jake grinned, no warmth in it. Just want you to remember who you are, Dan. You can play the good guy, go to church, but I know you. Once like me, always like me. No, Daniel said firmly. I'm not that man anymore. Leave, Jake, before I call the cops. Jake spat on the ground and walked off, his figure fading into the dark. But Daniel knew it wasn't over. After that night, Daniel prayed more. Not to banish Jake, but for strength to face him, to protect his family, to hold on to who he'd become. He confided in Pastor James, who urged him to trust God's guidance. Sometimes trials come to test us, James said. You've come further than you realize. Don't let the past drag you back. Daniel told Tommy too, who insisted on installing cameras around the garage and house. If that jerk tries anything, we'll have proof, Tommy said, resolute. Daniel agreed, though he didn't want to live in fear. Jake's visits dwindled, but his mark remained. Sarah attended church more, not out of sudden faith, but for comfort in the community. Emma and Noah sensed the tension, though Daniel kept them carefree, playing with them to ease their unasked questions. Trouble struck again in late June 2016. Tommy rushed into the house, pale. Daniel, get to the garage now. Something's happened. Heart-pounding, Daniel followed in Sarah's car. The garage door was smashed, glass strewn across the floor, tools overturned. Scrawled in red paint on the wall. You can't escape, Dan. Sarah gasped, hand over her mouth. Who did this? Daniel knew without proof. It was Jake's style, sabotage from the shadows. We need to call the cops, Tommy said, gripping a wrench like a weapon. Daniel nodded, not expecting much from police, but wanting Sarah and the kids to feel safe. Officers came, documented the scene, and promised to investigate. Alone afterward, Daniel sat on the porch with his Bible, reading Romans. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. He prayed not for victory, but to stay true to himself. Days later, Jake reappeared. Not at the garage, but at Daniel's doorstep. Disheveled, cigarette in hand, he stood under the streetlight. Daniel sent Sarah and the kids inside, then faced him with his crutch. What do you want, Jake? He demanded, calm but firm. Jake sneered. You think you're better than me? Church family, I know you, Dan. You're weak pretending to be strong. Daniel remembered the field, Jesus' eyes, and stood firm. I was like you once. Not anymore. You can't change me back. Jake stepped closer. I'll make you beg me to stop." Before he could act, police sirens cut through the night. Tommy emerged from the shadows, phone in hand. "Called them when I saw his car," he whispered. Jake was cuffed, glaring as he was led away. "You win this time," he snarled. "But I won't forget." Daniel watched them go, relief washing over him. He hadn't lost himself. Jake vanished after that, arrested, perhaps gone for good. Daniel didn't care. His family endured. Summer 2016 brought warmth and laughter. The garage rebuilt with church friends' help. Daniel taught Tommy, wrote his notebook, and lived slowly but fully. Sarah and he weren't perfect, but they learned to pause, apologize, and restart. One night, watching TV, she said, "I think I'm starting to believe, Daniel. Not like you, but in my own way." He pulled her close, smiling. "That's enough." At the Clarksville police station, Detective Harris faced Daniel. Jake Miller was arrested for theft and assault. He claims you planned a car theft with him 20 years ago, trying to drag you down for a lighter sentence. Daniel's stomach dropped. He remembered that drunken night. Stealing a car, abandoning it, never caught. Buried until now. "I won't deny it," he said hoarsely. "I was young, stupid. But I'm not that man anymore." Harris studied him. "His evidence is shaky, just his word. If we dig and someone IDs you, you could face charges. Understand?" "Yes," Daniel said. "Let me tell my family first." At home, Sarah waited, anxious after Tommy's call. "Police took you?" she asked, trembling. He sat her down and confessed. The theft, Jake, his buried mistakes. Her silence stung as she left for their bedroom. Alone, he prayed on the porch. "I don't ask you to erase the past. Give me strength to face it, and Sarah forgiveness." Morning came. Sarah emerged, eyes red but steady. "I'm mad you hid this," she said. "But I know you've changed. I don't want to lose you. No more secrets, okay?" "I promise," he said, tears falling. Weeks later, the police found no solid evidence beyond Jake's claims, and Detective Harris dropped the charges. But whispers spread in town. Some believed Daniel, others eyed him warily. The garage lost clients, and Tommy worked double to keep it afloat. Yet light pierced the darkness. Sarah stood by him, explaining to Emma and Noah in simple terms. Dad made mistakes but fixed them. Emma hugged him, saying, "I don't care what you did. I just want you here." Noah clung tighter. The church became a refuge. Pastor James held a prayer session for Daniel, and though he felt awkward standing before them, their support warmed him. Mrs. Margaret, his old Sunday school teacher, squeezed his hand. "God doesn't pick perfect people, Daniel. He picks those willing to change." Noah's 5th birthday in October 2016 was a celebration of resilience. Daniel and Sarah woke early, she baking a chocolate cake, he carving Noah's name into a wooden car. Emma ran around with balloons, shouting, "I'll tie these to the tree." The party was simple. Tommy brought soda, Grandma baked cookies but joyful. Noah beamed at his gift, pushing it across the room while Emma played cop chasing him. Around a fire later, Daniel told stories of fishing with Tommy as kids, mud covering them both. A call interrupted the night. Jake's voice rasped through. "I'm out of jail. You think you've won, but I'm not done." Daniel stepped outside, shielding Sarah. "I'm not who you want me to be," he said firmly. "Leave us alone." The line went dead, but the threat lingered. Daniel told Sarah about the call that night, unwilling to hide anymore. She listened, pale but steady. "What now?" she asked. "We report it," he said. "But we won't live in fear. We'll stay strong. Not by fighting but by living well." They called the police, who increased patrols, though little could be done without proof. He taught the kids to spot strangers and seek help, keeping it light. Nights he read the Bible with them, simple comfort, not sermons. Noah once asked, "Will God chase the bad guys away?" Daniel smiled. "He doesn't always, son. But he gives us strength to face them." October passed without Jake. The garage steadied, Sarah's garden bloomed with sunflowers, and the kids grew closer to Daniel. One afternoon, as they watched Emma and Noah play, Sarah said, "I want to try again, Daniel. Be a real family, not just survive." He took her hand, heart racing. "Me too. Always have." They sat, hands clasped as leaves fell. A quiet promise renewed. In late November, They drove to the Smoky Mountains for a family trip. Daniel navigated Tommy's old truck, Sarah guiding with a paper map, like old times. The kids sang in the back, eager for adventure. At a campsite near Gatlinburg, they pitched a tent by a creek, ate burgers and sat by a fire. That night, Sarah whispered, "I never thought we'd be like this again." Daniel replied, "I'm glad we are." Next morning, a sharp pain stabbed Daniel's chest. He collapsed, gasping. Sarah screamed for help, calling rescue as the kids watched, terrified. At the hospital, doctors diagnosed a mild heart attack, scars from the accident and stress. "Rest," they ordered, "or surgery next time." Sarah stayed by Daniel's side in the hospital, gripping his hand. "We'll get through this," she said, resolute. He feared not death, he'd faced it, but leaving her and the kids. That night, he prayed for time to fulfill his promises. In a dream, the field returned empty but peaceful, whispering all would be well. By dawn, the pain eased. He'd go home soon with strict rest. Back in Clarksville before Thanksgiving, Daniel rested while Sarah tended the garden. Tommy brought a slightly burnt turkey, Sarah made mashed potatoes, and the kids decorated with paper leaves. Holding hands, Daniel prayed, "Thank you for my life, this family, the good days and hard ones. Help us remember love matters most." Sarah's teary smile said it all. They ate, laughed, and felt whole. Winter 2016 brought snow and closed the garage intermittently. Tommy fixed his own house while Daniel stayed home playing with the kids. One morning, Tommy arrived tense. Some guy offered to buy the garage, big money. Mention Jake. Daniel's gut twisted. "We don't sell," he said. "It's family." Days later, Richard Vance knocked at Daniel's door on a snowy night. Tall, clad in black, he offered triple the garage's value, citing Jake. "I'm not selling," Daniel said, Sarah clutching his arm. Vance smirked. "Sometimes people lose things without selling. Good night." His threat hung in the air. Daniel reported Vance to Harris, who investigated but lacked proof. Tommy fortified the garage with locks and a guard. Sarah kept the house alive with game nights and movies. Emma said, "I like our home like this. I'm not scared with you here." Daniel vowed, "No one will hurt us." In late January 2017, Vance and Jake confronted Daniel at home. "Sell or we burn it," Vance warned. Jake taunted, "You're still me, Dan." Daniel stood firm. "I'm not afraid. You can't take what matters." Police arrived, Tommy had called, arresting them with recorded evidence. Jake spat, "I'll remember this." But Daniel felt free. Vance and Jake faced charges, ending their threat. Life resumed slowly, surely. Daniel wrote his notebook, weaving faith and family into it, no longer dreaming of the field but feeling its peace daily. Spring 2017 brought rain and green fields. Daniel watched Sarah garden, the kids play, Tommy haul tools. That night he told her, "I've lived what he asked, love." She replied, "You have. We have." He closed his eyes, feeling their warmth, knowing he'd found peace. Spring 2017 faded with gentle days. Daniel, no longer the broken man of 2015, wrote his legacy, not just repairs but stories of love and faith. Sarah's garden thrived, a symbol of hope. That May, beside her on the porch, he read Corinthians. "Love is patient, love is kind." "That's us," he said. She agreed. "We've endured." As the sun set, kids laughing, Tommy joking, Daniel knew this wasn't an end, but a full circle. From darkness to light, loss to redemption. He'd been saved, not just from death, but from a hollow life. In that moment, he felt Jesus smile from a distant field.